It is Friday, October 23rd, 2020, 5:01 p.m. And I want to tell you a story about my rudeness. It was some years ago. I want to say, not sure what year it was. And one day at the New Republic, there was a massacre. Basically the entire staff followed Frankie Four, an old friend, out the door. How many of them quit? How many of them were fired? I'm not sure, but there are a lot of names you know. Some of them famous, some of them infamous, some of them... But they were people that I had spent a lot of time with, one of whom, Yishai Schwartz, I'd kind of mentored, and we had to scramble to make sure he had a job. He came back to lawfare at that point. And it was a little bit after that, I don't remember how long, that I get an email from somebody I'd never met before named Brian Beutler, writing to me from the New Republic, inviting me to write something, or to either to write something or to talk to him about a story. I can't remember which it was. I'm afraid
it was neither of those things, actually.
It was neither of those things. What was it?
No, it was to invite you to be a guest on the podcast that I launched for the New Republic.
He was wishing you a happy birthday, and you wrote him back and said, "Fuck you, Brian Beutler."
It was pretty close. I think the rudest email I have ever written to a total stranger who was not being rude to me.
Do you want?
That's a first for Brian.
What?
I said that's a first for you, by the way. I feel
to get a rude email? No. Yeah.
No, I mean, like, normally you deserve it a little bit.
No, this was a gratuitous drive-by. I mean, it was it was something. I have it here, and like if given permission, I'll do a dramatic reading in a minute. But the timeline here is I took a job at the New Republic in May or so of 2014 to be like a web presence among mostly feature writers, as Frank and the editorial team there tried to bring the magazine writers into a more mixed digital print platform. And the experiment was cut short when Frank was fired, and most of the staff followed him. But it was only about 4 months after I had started, and I had left the job at Salon that I had been at less than a year. So here I was in this situation where I was going to be unemployed, which I couldn't do, and was going to have left one job after less than a year, and then a second job after 4 months, and suddenly I'm mid-career, unreliable person. So I stuck with it, I worked with the new editor, Gabriel Snyder, who's a great guy, a good journalist in his own right. And 3 years later, in May of 2017, which is pertinent because this was why I wanted Ben to be on my podcast, this was right when Jim Comey had been fired from the FBI. It was probably around the time. 3 years later?
It was a long time. It was 2.5 years after the purge, 3 years after I had started.
That makes it much worse, actually.
I figured, look, like the bad blood, kind of festered for a lot longer than I thought.
It's a really good thing that I invited Brian on the show, or we might have gotten nasty Graham.
Hang on, prior to this invitation, and also in the years since, like very talented people who Ben has fostered were guests on my podcast. It's not like he went and poisoned the well about me, and was like tried to get people not to associate with me. So I figured it was just some sort of like loyalty to friends. But so I also thought that given the newsworthiness of the moment and the amount of time that had passed since the shakeup at New Republic, that maybe the water had passed under the bridge, but it hadn't. So I wrote to Ben. I said, "Hi, Benjamin. Any chance you'd be willing to join me for an episode of my New Republic podcast early next week. I recorded a great episode with Susan Hennessy this week, but a huge amount has happened since then, and can't think of a better person to speak to all the developments than you. So I really was buttering Ben up to be on my show. If you're interested, let me know, and we can plan a time, logistics, etc. Either way, hope you're well and have a nice weekend. And how much time? Same day.
The first time we had ever communicated, right?
It's possible on Twitter in passing.
Yeah.
By then, yeah. I mean, I can't. I'd have to go back and check Twitter to see if we'd ever had any kind of exchange like
so
that.
How bad is it?
But it's more like. Let me just read. There's no like hello or anything like that. It just begins. I severed my relations with TNR when my friends were all purged on a single day. I swore an oath that day that I would never engage the magazine again, either as a contributor, I used to write a column for the magazine, or as reader. It's nothing personal, but such oaths hold unto the 7th generation, and by my count, we are only on the 2nd. My apologies, but I can't help you.
Damn, Ben! Jesus!
It was seriously asshole-ish. In my defense,
it wasn't really against Brian, though. You were
it was really nothing personal.
It was not against Brian at all. That was like a deep. With 7 generations, god damn it, Ben. That's like some serious grudge shit.
It was some biblical shit.
Yeah. I know. I was gonna say it. Like it was like capital R romantic, and my father's father's father. It was like Princess Bride-ish, but for a podcast.
To be fair to myself, which I am disappointed to be, because it was a seriously asshole-ish thing to do, and I've felt guilty about it ever since. But I was under inordinate stress that week for reasons related to the Comey firing, and I was suddenly prominent and visible in a way that I had never been in my life. And I, probably sent a bunch of emails in that time that, as well as just ignoring emails that were rude. Anyway, all of this is a very long-winded way
We've
of
all
apologizing.
done it, Ben. It's all okay. But it is pretty bad.
I was half expecting when I sent the invitation to be, to turn down on the basis of demand and, my rinky-dink little podcast, you probably had better things to do, and that maybe in the back of your mind, some sort of, disaffection for the new Republic would have been the decision maker, like the tiebreaker. But I kept the email just because it's so, you killed my father,
so
prepare to die.
unusually asshole-ish, yeah. Well,
we don't have fun anymore.
We don't have fun anymore. We get nasty emails from people for no reason.
Bad.
There's coronavirus. Trump is still president. But you are now no longer working for the New Republic. You are the editor-in-chief of Crooked Media's written presence. And welcome to In Lieu of Fun, where we do make fun of ourselves for past indiscretions.
A lot.
Good. I hope you guys don't know any of mine, but I guess I'll have to
make fun of ourselves. How do you guys know each other?
When did it start? TPM or we also have mutual friends in DC and journalism.
I would say that Brian is part of the Flophouse gang. We've had a lot of the Flophouse gang on slowly over time. Like Matt came on, and then Adam and Surer, and then who else? Julian. I mean, and Adam and Julian didn't live in the house, but
I didn't either.
You didn't either.
I was an adjunct or whatever.
I think you're in the New York Times story that they did on it, and so there's so we've had. Are you in that New York Times story?
They did a different story, I believe, or maybe the Washington Post did a related. I don't know. I lived in a different group house with Ezra and a couple other people that was separately profiled a couple years after the Flophouse profile. So I don't know. I guess this is like a rite of passage. Every couple of years, like people in their 20s who are starting their careers get profiled by by the big newspapers. But
but
I was around,
but that's not true. That group of friends that we had, and I talked about this before on the show, but I'm interested to hear kind of your take on it. That group of friends that we had, like, we were all Dave Weigel, like Spencer, you, Ezra, Matt, like, we're all working, like, in blogging and in, like, new, what at the time was, like, kind of new media. Like, we're writing for kind of liberal publications and kind of doing investigative journalism work and in various capacities. And, like, it was kind of just this very slow, like, kind of now everyone's at the top of the heap. Like, and you could kind of see it coming. But it's fascinating to kind of, like, be like, oh, yeah, I knew us all when we hung out drinking beer out of a keg on, like, blue plywood floors and, like,
the blue plywood floors. Yeah, I guess it's true that there was, you know, blogs began. I mean, if you even want to, like, predate the time when political blogging became prominent, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, people had their, I can't even remember what they were called, like the live journals or whatever, right? And then political bloggers were kind of, like, uneasily welcomed into the journalism world, and that entailed, you know, young people who were more or less working out of coffee shops having to acclimate themselves to the professional rigors of journalism. So 2005, 6, 7 was, I think, when that, like, evolution was happening. And so I guess it was more zeitgeisty at the time than it would be now to profile a bunch of young startup journalists. But I do remember thinking it's like, you know, there are a bunch of 25, 6, 7-year-olds in DC who are already more important and probably going to go on to do much more important things that aren't being profiled. So it always kind of struck me as odd, but obviously, like, when the New York Times calls and says, we want to put you in the newspaper and talk about the work you do, you don't say no. So, right.
So, Crooked Media is a fascinating organization. I think it is the first significant organization to start in the podcast space and back expand into written work. Normally,
that's right,
the progression is the other direction. Slate launches podcast company enterprises. The New York Times starts the Daily, right? But you guys did it in the opposite direction, which means that you're essentially the written editor for a company that is still principally known for its audio content. So I'm curious what that's like. What's the you know, is print the forgotten stepchild of Crooked Media, or like, how do they understand you?
I you know, that would be a great question for Favreau, who John Favreau, my boss, who engineered my hiring. I think you know, these guys are writers in addition to being podcast hosts. That's what they did before, not as journalists but as speechwriters. Right. I think they think of written journalism as being important, even though it's not financially the most viable way to do journalism. And they wanted a well-rounded media company, not just a flagship podcast with some satellite podcasts that that didn't, like, create opportunities to like get their tendrils into different kinds of content. And so that was where the, you know, both the interest in writing and the desire to have a print journalist kind of came together, and so they created a position, and that's where I came into the company. But it's interesting because when the way you described it is more or less exactly how I describe it. Is that, like, Crooked.com is the website for a podcast company that has a journalist or two, a print journalist or two working for it, not the other way around. And it's liberating in a way because, you know, the center of gravity of the company is so podcast based that some of the demands for traffic, for, you know, print advertising revenue, that kind of, like, tiny stream of money, are just not super relevant to how we conceive of what we do. So we have newsletters, which are both journalistic and revenue generating, and then I write articles. We take some freelance articles, but the point of them is to get the ideas that we want out into the world, and not to get traffic gangbusters for like small amounts of money from Google Ads or whatever. That's just it just doesn't figure into the model, and it's nice. It's a good place to be if you don't want to feel like you have to kind of be a hamster on a wheel about it all the time.
So it's super interesting to me the way that you're describing this, and the way that you describe it, and Ben describes it, and like you have described it in the past. One of the things that, sorry, my video is being bizarre. But one of the things that I have found so interesting about just like Crooked Media in the last couple of years is like that model strikes me as like the first model I've heard from a podcast to print. But that is actually like, but like all of the TV stations did that. Like all of NPR did that. Like NPR had to go from being like all kind of audio based thing to all of a sudden expecting to have a web presence, which meant that they had text based articles, right? And like NBC and ABC News, like I started my career at abcnews.com, which was, as I've described it many times, like the redheaded stepchild in the basement of ABC News. Like no one gave a flying fuck about like abcnews.com. And like half my job was just like taking transcripts of interviews and turning them into something that could seem like an article. But also then they had started to assign me things and I could pitch stories and do whatever else. And that was like a new thing, but it kind of strikes me as a similar junction, except the podcast seems different than radio in some really core ways for distribution reasons.
So I think that there's one important difference, which is that Crooked Media could survive totally fine with a website that didn't employ any journalists, right? Like, Jon Favreau had Keeping It 1600. He took it out of the company where it had been housed, and he built Pod Save America around it, which is the flagship show, and also the reason the company was able to expand and build more podcasts. In theory, Crooked.com could be a place to house all of that, plus merchandise and live show information, and there's Vote Save America, the activism and organizing wing of the company could be housed on Crooked.com, and I suppose they could hire an editor to write a newsletter, but the newsletter wouldn't have to be, consistent with what we think of as like journalistic standards, and it would be fine. The company would hum along fine without me, which is probably an admission against interest. But I think that the difference is that if like ABC had not created a website for news and then for articles, it would have been left behind in its space. Whereas a podcast company could just be a podcast company, and it could focus all of its growth on podcasts and other, higher revenue kinds of content, and just never think about writing. So it's a nice blessing for me that they want that. But it was not obligatory that they create this side of the company, and they did.
Do you think the audio nature of it is what interested Favreau and like speechwriters to it? Do you think that that kind of like very fundamental way of telling a story like resonated with him in particular?
I don't know. I honestly have no idea. I mean,
can you read his mind for me right now, Brian?
I'll honestly just ask him and tell you, like, off to the side after this is over, how it came to be that, I mean, my vague understanding is he left the Obama White House in 2012 or 2013, and he did some speech writing as a consultant for some time, and then he had a podcast with The Ringer, which was very successful, and I suppose there could have been a grand plan there, but I think it just kind of worked out, and between him being an affable host and somebody who has like political sophistication as a White House speechwriter, it kind of gelled, and so it just made sense to keep building on it. But that's honestly just a guess. I I will say though that it has worked out well enough that trying to get him to write for me is damn near impossible, and so it has worked out well one way or another, so well that like writing is like kind of something for me to do for the company, but not for my boss, unfortunately.
Yeah. So what then? What is the parameters of the sort of, like, you have, given the size of the staff for the written product, you can't be comprehensive.
No.
So, but you want stuff that's sort of thematically related enough to the subject of the podcast productions that it's going to engage similar audiences. So what's the parameters of what you guys do there? Like, how do you understand the mission set?
As narrowly in the terms of it, like my job as the editor and writer for the company, or
yeah, exactly. Like, so what's inbounds and out of bounds for you to write or for you to commission pieces on?
Look, I've never been censored for anything that I've written or wanted to write.
I mean, how do you conceive of, like, what's the sort of thing you want to be publishing, given the given the peculiarities of the undertaking?
Right. Okay. So I kind of think of it in two ways. One is, you're right, it can't be like we could have set Crooked.com up as a blog for me to write multiple times a day, the way Kevin Drum does for Mother Jones, and that would have worked. I prefer to write at greater length than that, and without the sort of need to feed the beast all the time. So I write articles. I edit a daily newsletter that my writer Sarah Lazarus, who's brilliant, writes, and then I also write a weekly newsletter. And ideally the daily newsletter is as close to comprehensive as to political news as it can be. We top it with the most important developments of the day, a digest of a roundup of other sort of below the radar stories, several other things, so that people who read it can kind of be off Twitter, read the newsletter, feel like they got caught up on the day's news. The articles I try to keep on a different kind of zeitgeist that's sort of about like big debates within liberal politics, or sort of like bigger picture analysis of what's happening in U.S. politics, whether that's confined to just the left or not. And all of it is sort of consistent with, the podcast is called Pod Save America for a reason. I mean, the company was formed with the idea in mind that America was in a state of crisis, and that a good kind of media was going to be a part of an answer to solving the crisis. And so all of the work is in some way tied back to the core conceit that there's a sort of authoritarian, anti-democratic wave crashing over the country, and everyone needs to kind of batten down and then figure out ways to beat it back and rise against it. And so you find very little on Crooked.com or in the newsletter, or I think in the podcast, which are now too numerous for me to listen to all of every week. All of it is kind of we all agree with that basic premise, and the content kind of flows from it.
Yeah. So interesting that you like say that, like, this premise, like in 2017, of like the country needs this type of like outlet, and that there needs to be something, because I actually think that you and I came up in the same type of moment coming out of George W. Bush, and like I joined the journalism scene in 2006. Ugh. And
we overlap at TPM, right, Kate? Like we worked at the same time at Did you hightail
Maybe
it before?
really briefly, but we were both there.
Yeah. Okay.
But like one of the things that I'm going to be totally honest, and you don't have to, like, I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, like, this isn't going to make you uncomfortable, but like one of the things that like I saw when I worked in media was that like I saw stories move quite literally from Daily Kos, like talking points memo, to like you know, New York Times would take it up, and then like, or you know, CNN would take it up or something. Sometimes they would credit like TPM or whatever, and then like eventually it would be like on Maddow, or it would be on like, and so this was how like I saw like stories happen, and it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't about the nature of the story necessarily. A lot of times, especially when it was like certain types of politics, it was like decisions that people that no one was paying any attention to, like little you and little me, like kind of like sitting in these things, were like, or Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo or whatever else, we're kind of making these like decisions of like, I'm going to cover that story or I'm not going to cover that story. And this is going to be like where these big behemoth news organizations get some of their news. And seeing that happen and seeing that kind of like the way that news was created like that, was a little bit dysphoric, honestly. Like I remember like being really like kind of like, I didn't disagree with any of the stories that were coming out, right? Like I my politics aligned with them, but it felt in some way kind of like, okay, well, I know that there are other stories that aren't coming out, or like there are slightly other things that aren't being surfaced. And it was like, I just remember being kind of in like this, like watching the sausage get made and being a little horrified by it. And I just kind of like wonder if like you have ever had that moment, or like, you know, I mean, now you're on like in a media company that's like namedly progressive. And so it's like, doesn't have to be anything else, but I'm just curious.
So I guess I don't, you know, before I entered journalism, I had never really considered how the sausage got made, but having been in it for a while, I kind of found it fun, and like I could have a positive impact on how larger legacy media covered things when I realized that they relied on, you know, sort of junior reporters to be assignment editors, right? If TPM decided that the U.S. attorney scandal was an important thing to cover,
then all of a sudden the New York Times stole the story. Yeah.
Yeah, and look, like that can be frustrating when you don't get the credit, which
that's, I mean, not the point. But like, yes, like, totally,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
But you know, without TPM, it's possible that would have gone unnoticed, and then it just would have never been anything that there just never would have been any accountability for it. That's a great point. Right, and but also like, look, like, and I think that this way of doing things can have a baleful effect on the overall quality of like what comes out on like primetime news or on the front page of the New York Times, or where a lot of people just kind of absorb the news passively. But I also just don't think that there was ever a golden age where there was some neutral standard for how the people who run those big companies made their decisions about what went on the front page, right? You know, before there was an internet, before there was Twitter, before there was email, you know, if you worked on the Hill, you would phone in like a phone booth, literally in the Capitol, you know, like what you saw and what you thought was important to your headquarters, and they would make decisions about what to you know, make prominent on the front page or within the newspaper on the basis of kind of not arbitrary, but the judgment calls of beat reporters. And I don't know that I could improve on that model, but and I don't know if like the internet has made that better or worse. Like Twitter can be a really bad assignment editor, but it can be a good one too.
I get a lot of requests for writing op-eds out of like tweet threads that I write.
Right.
Like that's like seems to be the new thing. Like I'm just like, okay, like I guess that's like how you go and find people to write op-eds now. So we're going to bring in some questions, but last thing was like, I should have just asked, do you remember when you were shot?
No, what are you talking about?
I know. That didn't happen. I was telling Ben the story. He'd never heard it. And I was like, oh God, that was horrifying. I remember that being horrifying. If it's not traumatic to you, do you remember that?
No, it's, of
do you
course,
remember,
yeah.
You want to talk about it? Like, I think
sure.
it's a crazy story.
I mean, it's, I don't mind talking about it at all. I've written about it. I wrote about it
you wrote about it.
I was a columnist. It's funny because it's now, 12 and a half years ago. And, I'm in a phase of my life where I'm not meeting new people at a rapid clip. And so most of the people that I interact with day to day are kind of familiar with it. So I don't have a chance to bring it up or tell the story very much. And I've never shied away from doing it when asked. But it's been a while. So this was July, right before 4th of July in 2008. So still like prime Flophouse era. I had been out on, this was like, I'm embarrassed to say it was like a Monday or Tuesday night. So I was, I was not being like that responsible, but I was out out drinking with a close friend of mine. And we stayed until last call. And then we decided that we were going to go walk to the diner in Adams Morgan, 24-hour diner. And we kind of took not a shortcut, it's just the way, but it was, like a dark street.
Through
Euclid
like
Street
an alleyway, yeah.
No, it's just a one-way street, not a lot of light. Apartment buildings mostly on both sides, so there's not like, people in bedrooms near the street level that might, kind of deter people from mugging others. So anyway, we got confronted by a couple of kids demanding our phones, and kind of probably foolishly declined to give our phones away. This was 2008, so it was like first generation iPhone probably.
You had like a Samsung Galaxy. Don't even lie. Like you just totally.
No, it was an iPhone. I remember because like 2 months after I got out of the hospital. 2 months after I got out of the hospital from this incident, I left the fucking iPhone in a cab, and I had to get a new one. So I could have just given my phone and possibly avoided the whole shooting, but I also don't know. So we resisted, and I thought we're going to get into a fight. I hope these guys don't have knives or like friends around the corner, because they were young kids, and they were insistent. And then the one that was standing in front of my friend pulled out a gun and handed it to the guy who was standing in front of me, which is why we kind of assumed this was a gang initiation situation, so it may be good that we didn't give them our phones. Anyway, he just aimed a gun at me and fired 3 times, and they ran away, and I hit the ground. But then I got up, and I brushed the dirt off of me, and it's like, that was weird. Like, I saw a gun, I heard it go off, I definitely fell down.
Wait, really?
So
I never heard this part of the story, and you just stood back up?
Yeah. So there's a lot
totally
of things about how people. I think there was adrenaline, but also, it was the bullets. There was a 25 caliber gun, and so the damage it does to the body is kind of, it's not immediately painful, and it's kind of slow to catch up with you. So a mix of adrenaline and the fact that I didn't have giant, gaping bullet holes in me, made it so that I was able to get back up. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me, and my shoulder was a little sore. But I also started rationalizing to myself, well, like, I saw a gun and I heard it go off and I fell down, but I'm standing up, I feel fine, and so it was probably just a rubber bullet or something like that, and like, what a horrible prank, but let's keep going to the diner. So we start walking, like, that was weird, we're gonna carry on with our night like nothing happened. And about a half a block later, my shoulder's still hurting, I touch it, and it's damp, like there's like the shirt is wet. So it was a red shirt, so I took it off so I could see, and like, I'm bleeding. And so now we know it's a real gun, and also that the kids who shot me are somewhere nearby with a gun. So we start running, and I tell him to get on his phone and call 911. And he talks to the dispatch and says, my friend's been shot, and they're like, where are you? And he said, we're running west on Euclid Street. And they say, stop running, so we know where to send the ambulance. And he says, but somebody just shot my friend, so we're trying to get away from them. So we make it about a block and a half and turn north on I think 17th Street at some point, and that's when the fact that I had
been shot suddenly hit you.
Yeah, well, I had organ. I had my spleen.
You got hit in the liver. I thought I remembered. Or
no,
something.
it was a spleen, which is
spleen.
not an organ you need necessarily, but it's highly vascular.
You like to have around.
So, well, you don't want it to get shot because it bleeds really heavily. So you
were hit in the shoulder and in the spleen.
Shoulder. Well, so the thing about these little bullets is they bounce around. So what was causing me the distress and what endangered my life was that I was bleeding internally. But I also had a collapsed lung. I had a hematoma on my kidney. I had a puncture wound in my stomach. And I had an exit wound in my back that kind of cut the difference between my aorta and my spine. So if it had not split between them, I would have either bled out from the aorta or I would have been paralyzed. So everyone tells me I'm lucky, and I'm like, I don't really feel very lucky. That was pretty terrible thing to go through. Yeah. But anyway, so at some point I couldn't run anymore, and I realized that I was not doing great. And so I just made a point of focusing on anything concrete that I could and making sure I didn't lose focus on it. And the ambulance came by, and Matt flagged it down. Matt's the friend I was with, and not Iglesias, different Matt.
Yeah,
and they
I know that
they put an IV in my arm just to kind of get my blood pressure moving, because that's what was happening. Is I was entering shock because I was bleeding from my spleen. And that picked my blood pressure up, and that's when the pain of being shot, the nerve damage and the fact that my chest cavity was kind of swollen, all that pain started becoming very real. They took me in the ambulance to hospital center, and they asked for my social security number, my father's cell phone number, and the fact that I was able to recite all these
it's amazing
numbers off the top of my well, it also it put me at ease, because I'm like, if I was in really bad shape, would I be that with it? And they basically got me there, and they said, good news is you made it. The bad news is we have to put you into surgery to save your life. And so I said, fine, I just need the painkillers, get me into surgery. And they did, and I woke up the next day, a few hours later, I guess, and I had full recollection of everything that happened. But I also thought, the only place I know I got shot was in my shoulder, and they also said they took out my spleen, but I know people get their appendix out and then they're able to leave the hospital within a day. So I sat up and I felt like I had done 1,000 sit-ups or so, and my shoulder was basically fine. It had full mobility, but when I felt that soreness in my abdomen, I touched it and I had staples all the way down my chest. So I feel like I was supposed to fly to visit my sister in Seattle the next day, and I started thinking, is there any way I'm going to make my flight? And the answer was no. So I was hospitalized for about 10 or 11 days.
Yeah, you were in there a long time. I remember following the breakouts from people. Everyone was very concerned and reporting on the fact that you've been shot, but it was also it was also very weird, because it's funny hearing your recollection of it. Just, I don't want to interrupt too much, but I just want to say your recollection of it is fascinating, because also there was Brian got and he's fine. He's gonna be fine.
There was a game of telephone.
He said he was fine, and then but he had multiple surgeries, and he's gonna be in the hospital for the next days. And people were
I had people who thought,
is he that fine? That seems not
I had
fine.
people who thought that. I had people who told me that they heard that I was going to be flown to Hopkins and that they might have to remove my leg, which I did not get shot in. I mean, I don't know how the game of telephone spun that.
Next time that happens, if you need someone to remove your leg, you can just call me. I do it all the time for people. It's just
but actually,
it's a side project.
This ties us back to where we started, because it was 10 days in the hospital and about a 3-month recovery, but the sort of contract gig that I had didn't get renewed on account of I was basically out of commission, and so I moved up to New York where the girl I was seeing at the time lived, and that's why I was in New York to interview for the job at TPM, which then moved me back to DC to cover healthcare reform and put me on the professional trajectory that I'm still on. So in a weird way, I have no idea if this hadn't happened, whether I'd be on the show right now, or what my career would look like. It was, the sliding doors version of this is like, do I wish that hadn't happened? It's like, I don't know. I'm pretty happy with how my life looks now, but there's no way of knowing that it would have looked like this if that like weird thing hadn't happened.
I remember Josh being very moved by like your being shot and like it kind of like shaking him. Like he had like read you a whole bunch and like was following your like young career and then like was like kind of horrified when that happened. So like that's really great. I'm like glad you know that worked out. We have to take questions, but
okay, let's do
thanks for sharing that story. I was actually like weird from
it's an amazing story.
It was a good story.
Kevin Donahue, the floor is yours.
Hey Brian, nice to talk to you.
You too.
So my sense during the Democratic primary was that there was like a passive support at Crooked Media for Elizabeth Warren, or at least like a lot of sympathy towards her point of view and the style with which you wanted to solve problems that you cared about, Crooked Media cared about. And I also sense that there was like a general skepticism of the value of the Biden candidacy and the value of Biden presidency. So my question is that an accurate read or an accurate assessment? And do you still feel that way? And where do you stand on the strength and weaknesses of Joe as a candidate and hopefully as a president?
So the first part of Crooked Media is neutral in Democratic primaries. I guess there may be exceptions, but in the Democratic presidential primary, for sure, I think you're right to observe that, like a lot of people who work there diagnose the problems that we have in the United States in our political system the same way Elizabeth Warren does. And so that's probably what you picked up on, and I think it's reasonable to pick up on that. I think that the concerns about Biden through the primary have almost entirely evaporated because, everyone kind of assumes that somebody who's not a great primary candidate would lose an election, but then you never get to test that because they lose the primary. And I think that there were concerns about, and I think we're borne out by how the actual primary played out, right? Like Joe Biden entered the race, he was 35%, seemingly mostly on name recognition, having been Obama's vice president. But as you got close to the first contest, he kind of fell off a cliff and almost lost. And that worried me as somebody who thinks like it's absolutely critical that Democrats win the election. But it turns out he pulled it off, won the primary, and has been a much stronger general election candidate than I would have anticipated on the basis of how his primary went. To connect those two ideas, if there was skepticism beyond just the sort of election tactics and his performance at debates during the primary, I think that because his views on how to make Congress functional, how to make legislative change happen in the country were so different from somebody like Warren's and thus from my own. I worried that if he were to get the nomination, whatever his political difficulties might be, which turn out to have been didn't really seemingly need to worry about them so much, that he would have a tough go of it as president because he wants to keep the filibuster and cut deals with Mitch McConnell, and just had a diagnosis of the problems with the United States politics that were completely like crazy to me. But I think that as things have changed, as coronavirus hit, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, a bunch of developments have kind of forced him to reckon with what his, the old way of doing things that I think he would prefer to keep doing. And he has moved in in I think a smart and healthy direction towards some sort of more realistic assessment of what's going on in the country, and has sort of embraced the idea that the filibuster might need to go, that the courts might need to be reformed, that that you can't plan your legacy around the idea that Mitch McConnell is going to provide you votes for it, and thus you need to work with the votes you have in the Democratic Party to get what you want done. And so I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying what you picked up on, I think, is was reasonably real. A lot of those concerns have been allayed by the evolution of the campaign. And most importantly, Biden is, I think, disproves the assumption that a bad primary candidate will be a bad general election candidate, because I still kind of think he was a bad primary candidate, but he's run a really good general election campaign.
Whoa, that I was not expecting, that particular visage of Rick Fleischer, but we will get to that.
What the fuck is going on?
I don't know. It's the unmasking controversy, I suppose.
Apparently.
We're going to get to an explanation of that before the day is done. But John Bordeaux, who is on a campaign for the highest Rate My Skype Room background in the world.
That's
Who the hell can compete with a vintage Coke machine? For the love
awesome,
of God.
John.
Yeah.
Is that a Mark? Is that a Martin guitar?
It probably is. I don't know.
He needs
John
to.
is awesome.
John, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, you have to unmute.
That's beautiful. Oh no!
There you are.
What?
No! Mute it again. Unmute him.
I
Ben.
think I may have. I'm trying.
God, you're fucking.
All right, I'm going to leave it alone. You're
Yes,
going to
sir.
unmute it. You can't either? All right. Stay.
Oh no!
Can you hold up
Hang
the
on.
sign?
When this happened.
Hang on. All right, I'm going to remove you and bring you back in. In the meantime, Rick Fleischer, explain yourself.
Yeah, way to be literally some type of horror movie on my. It's a
I
good
think it
thing
was
I'm here with friends.
I think
That's
it
all
was
I
a
have to
joke
say.
about unmasking.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No, I've been joking in the chat for a couple days now. I'm waiting for someone to show up with a bag over their head, and
It's pretty funny.
opportunity arose. So there you go.
All right, I'm going to interpret it as a jibe at Devin Nunes. The floor is yours.
All right. Let me see if I can find. Oh crap.
Oh, John Bordeaux, you have to mute yourself, or someone does.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. Shoot, is that me?
Wait, I'm going to mute everybody except you.
1, 2, 3. It's not. All right. All right. Has Crookedity discussed how business is going to change after Trump, especially with close ties to Biden? And how can we support how will they support the new administration? Am I muted now? Yeah.
You're fine. Go
Okay.
ahead. Start over.
Cool. Yes, thanks. Has Crookedity discussed how the business is going to change after Trump, especially with Biden now in tow, and having close ties with him? And with the new administration, there's some policies that they can help push forward, possibly. Also, fans are somewhat maybe eager to have more impact and be able to be a force out there, and this could be a way to have some sort of relationship there, and it's going to be a new form of or mode of activism for you guys, with being an outsider versus somewhat inside, or right on the outside with some sort of connection. So that's it.
I gotta unmute people now.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
There.
So, without divulging anything too proprietary, obviously the business model, content model will change depending on the outcome of the election. I mean, what Crooked Media looks like if Trump is reelected versus if Biden wins the presidency but not the Senate, versus if Democrats win a governing trifecta, are three different models of journalism, just like any newspaper or or news program is going to have different coverage on the basis of like how history turns on its hinges, right? That said, I with if we assume, knock on wood, that that Biden wins, I think that the company in the immediate term will be less election focused because there won't be an election. Hopefully, it will be a situation where Democrats will be able to make some policy, and so there will be more focus on policy coverage. And I have an echo, but also you sort of commitment. Like we have I think a pretty clear sense of what the country needs. There are going to be remaining challenges to American democracy, and a lot of work for Democrats to do to address those challenges, but also address the climate crisis, also address immigration, a whole host of other policy issues. So in addition to covering them, I think that we'll be trying to advance a point of view that like lends itself to getting those kinds of things done. Even if the sorry, I got a cat here. Even if the politics of it get tricky for Democrats in Congress or for the administration.
Do you see yourselves as having a role in? So one of the things that's been very striking about American counter-cyclical politics since 1992, really, is that the party in power disproportionately gets creamed in off-year elections, right? Mm-hmm. So Democrats in 94, Republicans in 2006, Democrats in 2010 and 2014, Trump in 2018. It really sucks to be the incumbent in an off-year cycle.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, you guys have mobilized an incredible activist constituency through this very unusual combination of journalism, showmanship, commentary, and very overt. And one of the things I kind of admire about it is you don't try to hide it, right? You're kind of, now's the part where we tell you give money to so-and-so or volunteer for this, mm-hmm. right? There's an overtly activist dimension to mm-hmm. it. And so what is the role of that when it's not an election year, but when you're going into a cycle where maybe your guy's in power, and you kind of know that the default is that he's going to get wiped out. Nancy Pelosi is going to get killed, metaphorically, of course, in the off year. Does something like Crooked Media have an ongoing organizing role in defending the gains that you make?
So I think so, and also I think that I think it's like a little too pat to assume that if Democrats do a lot of things that progressives in particular want them to do, then they are going to increase the likelihood that they get wiped out in the primaries. And if that were true, it would create this tension between pressuring Democrats to do bold things in the democracy reform space or in climate change space or whatever, and trying to protect vulnerable incumbents or whatever. And that would be a tough balance to strike. My own personal view on it is that the N from 1992 to 2020 is fairly small.
It's a small
N.
Yeah.
It's a small N, and one of the N is 2010, when Barack Obama came into power at the bottom of basically a depression, and by the time the midterms rolled around, the recovery was A, slow, but B, incomplete, and so Democrats paid a huge price. But if you reimagine those first 2 years as where Democrats decided we are going to make sure that by 2010 we're clearly in a U-shaped recovery, and people see that voting for Democrats has paid off in their lives and made things better. That I don't know if they would have kept the House. I can't, you can't run that experiment more than once. But I think that these things are tied together, and so my hope is that the work Crooked Media does to encourage Democrats to help people in material ways, make their votes count more, make sure that the plague that we're all dealing with is is under control, that the economic damage that it's caused is being rectified, that doing those things, even in a context where there's all kinds of political controversy, maybe Democrats expand the Supreme Court and Republicans get super upset about it, that the best way to ensure against that is to not leave the middle of the country dissatisfied with the results of governing. So I don't think that there's like as much of a tension there as it seems. I think obviously as the governing phase of the first 2 years gives way to the election phase, that the Congress will slow down as it always does, and elections will ramp up, and the focus of our coverage and what the company does on the activism and organizing side will change, but that we don't really see these things as in so much tension, and in fact, good governing will lead to the best possible outcome 2 years down the road. So take the audience we've built, deploy it towards doing good work in the policymaking realm, and then from there to trying to lock down the gains of the election, assuming it goes well.
John Bordeaux, let's see if we can get your question without too much echo.
How does that work? Does it echo?
No.
Is that too much? Excellent. Okay, great. Sorry about the delays and such. Yes, that is a Martin. I'm blanking on the model number. I apologize for that. Kate, ignore the haters. I love the Brooklyn tuxedo. My daughter-in-law wears them all the time. Exactly. Brian, so I appreciate the last couple of questions on the role of Crooked Media in a Biden administration. Let's just go there, a Biden administration. And I empathize deeply with the Pod Save America mission statement and the urge to start that, the motivation. But I'm old enough to remember Rush Limbaugh in 1992 starting America Held Hostage the day Clinton took office, and positioning as if the Democrats were an existential threat, which of course led to all sorts of things, 95 and such, the Newt Gingrich. And while I think Pod Save is right, I also want to put aside my bias and say, where are we headed? When do we de-escalate? And what, if anything, is Crooked Media's role in helping to de-escalate, if that's even, because I think that's the only path we can get on without just coming apart altogether.
So I can't speak for the company exactly in answering this question, but I do have some ideas about it. I mean, one thing is that I just think that like liberal media discourse and progressive media discourse is not like Rush Limbaugh or Fox News. Like we adhere to like certain both professional and small L liberal standards that are important to us, and also that we're sort of fighting to restore in American politics generally. That being said, I think that like the answer to de-escalation is to reform the political system in a way that makes it so that Republicans see less advantage from things like suppressing votes, engaging in propaganda, using their control of the judiciary to govern without winning elections, so that they have to compete with arguments for why they should be given governing power and with policies that people like. And when you do that, then you get back into a more healthy mode of discourse that doesn't require a Rush Limbaugh to come in and say that the opposition is a bunch of terrorists who want to destroy the country, but like their ideas for healthcare reform are going to be too disruptive. We have better, more sensible ones that will keep everyone, win with a conservative argument that isn't like this sort of like hyper reactionary policy mode that they've been on for a couple decades now, at least.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and we do have to wrap, but I just was going to say that, like, I think that, like, what you're kind of talking about, and I think that it's true, that, like, there is a part of the Republican Party that has exploited all of these loopholes in the system, that has, like, exploited the rules to, like, make good of, like, these things, like, you know, that wasn't what we meant when we, like, decided to do it this way. Like, when we decided to appoint justices for life, it didn't mean stack the courts with FedSoc people that you groomed for the last 30 years through, like, individual grants to kind of, like, nurture their careers and everything else. I get it. But that being said, like, one of the things that does worry me as a progressive and as someone who's identifies as liberal is just, like, the court packing stuff, because that does seem like an abandonment of principles to this kind of gamesmanship of, like, let's abandon the principles and let's play the game. Like, they're playing the game, we should play the game. And, like, I just feel like that's we're gonna lose. Like, there's just not gonna be a good solution there.
So we could do a whole in lieu of fun on
the
norm.
I'm very good at like bringing up some giant fiery issue right at the end of things.
Let me try to do this in 2 minutes if I can, but I might not be able to. I agree, in an ideal world it wouldn't be a tit for tat thing, but I honestly think that the logic of, if you do well enough in election to control the House, the Senate, and the White House, that there's a more small d democratic logic to saying, okay, we are not going to let the court throw out all the bills we pass by adding seats to it, than just saying, oh, Ruth Bader Ginsburg happened to die, and so now nothing that we pass is going to withstand judicial review, right? So even though the ping-ponging of court packing is not ideal in its own right, I think it's actually an improvement over what we have now and the specific conditions Democrats are poised to inherit. If you use that as like a your leverage is that we'll do that. We'll just make the court 13 seats. Here's our rationale for it. Trump cheated in the election. They took the Scalia vacancy and gave it to Trump, so he had 5 years of advice and consent, even though he had a 4-year term. They also filled the Ginsburg vacancy in the middle of the election. The logic for expanding all the courts is there. That's what we're going to do, unless you want to talk about something that's a little bit more technocratic. The Buttigieg plan of 5, 5, and 5, which I would be for that. But I also think that, like, the goal should be that the illiberal party in the country doesn't think that it can just come in and undo that and then reimpose minority rule once the pendulum swings back in the other direction. And so my primary concern is that Democrats understand that that's what will happen unless they level the playing field of democracy, so that both parties, every person's vote basically counts the same as everyone else's, and both parties have to compete for votes, ideally everywhere in the country, on the basis of, like, they should be seeking votes, not trying to push out voters that they think will vote against them. And if that entails some period of time where it's like, we're going to have to add seats to the court until things simmer down and we can have a more reasoned discussion about the trajectory of American policy, I think so be it. It's not what I would want, but I didn't want Newt Gingrich to come in and ruin the country 25 years ago, and then for the Republican Party to nominate Donald Trump and then govern the way they've governed. So I don't know, like, where standing down seems just completely insane to me.
No, I think that's right.
Just a historical reminder of the way the last court packing plan ended, which is that it failed, but it didn't fail, in the sense that Charles Evans Hughes, who was then the Chief Justice, kind of took the message that they had a real problem if they kept striking everything down, and the famed switch in time to save 9 the court actually was quite responsive to the court packing plan. And so one possibility
not clear, by
is,
the way, that that's like something that like the Constitution contemplates, but
no,
like,
but it
right.
is, but it is pretty clear that it happened.
Yeah, no, it did, but like
and
it's just
also,
like,
and it's also pretty clear that Roosevelt, within a relatively short time of then, ended up replacing the relevant justices with people of his own. And so, the interesting question to me is whether the Republicans, having debased themselves the way they have, you create enough longevity in Democratic control of the Senate and the White House that actually, between the possibility of adding seats and just attrition, the problem actually takes care of itself without you ever having to do it. And I do think that's a possibility.
Can I say one thing?
Please.
I know that we're over, but
that happens.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right. I thought that there was a decent chance that after the end of the Bush administration that Republicans would be in the wilderness for a long time, and they came back 2 years later. The Lochner era did come to an end because of a court packing threat, but it had been the Lochner era for like 3 or 4 decades by the time it was over. And if we're entering a new era like that and it lasts for 4 decades, that's the rest of my life. And I don't want to live in a country like that.
But wait a minute, just to be clear, the court packing plan, if you're going to compare now to the court packing plan, this is 1937. This is the end of the Lochner era, right?
Well, it depends, right? Because
no, Brian's right. The Lochner era did. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
No, but
I
compare dates of court packing plan to date of court packing plan.
But also, when the court packing threat was leveled, Democrats had enormous majorities, and the sort of political valence of things was not so like right now. If Joe Biden comes in and says, if you start throwing out our bills, including Obamacare, but including Medicare, we're going to pack the court, it is within the power of judges appointed for life to say, all right, we won't until you lose the Senate, right? And then it's too late. So my fear is that if you have these strategic and ideologically, and I think it's fair to say in the case of at least 3 or 4 of them, partisan aligned justices of the Supreme Court, and you take a flyer on Republicans never winning back the Senate, you're liable to touch off another 3 or 4 decades of Lochner-style jurisprudence that will consume the country and democracy will collapse. I just think it's a very high.
I guess I'm not actually disagreeing with you about that. I just think the interaction between the threat of court packing, electoral, party response to electoral rebuke, and the actuarial tables. And remember, even with the younger additions to the court, the actuarial tables do not favor these 9 people being a static group for a long period of time. The system is a little bit more fluid than it feels when we're about to confirm Amy Coney Barrett, who's like my age or younger.
I was just going to say really quickly, Brian, that I think like when you say things like, I don't want to live the next 30 or 40 years through a Lochner era, I think you already have. I think that a lot of the policies that were created during that period didn't impact the people who lived through the 30 or 40 years of them being created instantly in the courts, but have really been felt by people in the decade since. And that's kind of like actually like a little bit of like the long tail that like no one, it's not like it's not a sexy one-to-one that I can but my point is like we all have dealt with like the fallout of the Lochner courts and we have not
experienced what I mean. I wrote one of my last features, I think, for the New Republic was for the magazine, was called The Rehabilitationist. It was about the Randy Barnett and the the openly pro-Lochner libertarian edge of the conservative legal movement. And since then, things have changed. Trump won. Neil Gorsuch and Kavanaugh on the court. They have signaled that they support the non-delegation doctrine. Amy Coney Barrett probably supports this too. If the court embraces it, it's going to change things very radically in a way that I think that we have not experienced since 1940, since before any of us were alive.
Just like
and
the Spanish flu. So it's great.
And look, like if you look at norms as they exist now, I see what you're talking about as being like a prudential argument for not being too aggressive because things might not go as badly as you're worried that they're going to. But if you think about things in a sort of different prudential light, like a 1% doctrine light, like that there's a 1% chance that they will wait until the Senate is in Republican hands again and then completely upend American jurisprudence, then the safe thing to do is just say no. Like what the way the courts have been stacked in the last 4 years is not a legitimate reflection of like the desires of free people in the United States. And so we need to address it now. And then having diffused the threat, let's come together and come up with a system that doesn't lend itself to this high stakes back and forth every 4 or 8 years. Because I agree, at some point you end up with this absurd
after
situation.
This election, let's get rid of all elections.
We're going to leave it there
Okay.
on that cheerful note. Brian, my apologies again for my very rude email. It's a pleasure to meet you. Kate is flitting in and out.
I'm here.
We are going to be back tomorrow, 22 hours and 47 minutes from now. We are going to plan the Election Day show. So, y'all,
and the Halloween show. We also get Halloween, Ben.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We're going to plan the Halloween show. It's going to be fabulous. So join us then. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. We do send very inappropriate emails to strangers. See you later.
And